Good evening, everyone. We are here with another Zoom into Books presentation, and tonight we are featuring Independent Author of the Year, Rick Robinson, and he's going to do a talk entitled The Stories Behind the Books. So without further ado, go ahead and take it away, Rick.
Thanks, Ashley. It's great to be with everyone this evening. You know, it's interesting because if you take a look behind me, I pulled out the old banner that I used when I first started writing books for Headline Books. And it's interesting because I look back at that picture back there, and it seems that somewhere along the way, I guess video adds 20 years to your hairline. And also adds a couple years of gray onto it as well. But it was remarkable to actually start out until doing this presentation and getting ready to do it, because I had realized under this that I've done 11 titles now for Headline Books. 10 are available in paper, 1 is Kindle only. And it was that whole idea that we talked about in the session where I talked about how to write the next great American novel, that the idea came about for me. I had been somebody who had always been involved in politics, but I had wanted to write the great American coming of age novel. But a friend of mine from, there was a business that I was in, a client of mine said to me, you know, you've got all these great stories about politics. Why are you sitting back and why are you trying to write a coming of age novel? You could put all of these stories together and try to come up with a political thriller. And for the first book, that's exactly what happened. I kind of put aside the whole idea of this coming of age novel that I had been thinking about since I was 17 years old, and started just writing down the stories that I had remembered from being involved in politics for over 30 years. And the first thing that came up was the first book that I ever published. Photographer there, Jason Dudas, catching me when I didn't have all gray hair. But the first book that I wrote was a book called Mancimum Contribution. Now, the Mancimum Contribution was really where I started putting together the different characters that you see through the next 6 books we'll talk about. And the series is called the Richard Thompson series. And Richard Thompson is a former local city councilman in northern Kentucky who decides he wants to run for Congress. And the people that are around him and that surround him in each of these books always seem to find themselves in trouble and always find themselves in different situations. And that's where the thriller aspect comes from. But when I first started writing this book, I hadn't really read a thriller since, I don't know, maybe The Firm or The Pelican Brief. I just hadn't read that genre of book very often. So I just started throwing together stories that I thought would be interesting and developing characters that I thought folks might enjoy looking at as they read through a story. Now, so when I did this, there were basically 2 characters that I came up that were involved with, and they were Richard Thompson, who was running for Congress, and Michael Griffith, who was the campaign manager for Thompson. Now, they had been together since they had been fraternity brothers at Eastern Kentucky University. One had gone off and started a family, go back to Northern Kentucky, was a local city councilman. The other one, Michael Griffith, had become the big shot of campaign consultants nationally. And those are the 2 characters. And people ask me sometimes, where do those 2 characters really come from? Who are those people? And the first thing that I started doing was that I took those 2 characters, and those 2 characters were wrapped up everything that I knew about politics or being a candidate or the people that I had been around were in those characters. So when you take a look at Richard Thompson, it had been around being around people here locally in northern Kentucky, like Clyde Middleton and Lawson Walker and Barry Caldwell, people whose campaigns that I had run when I had been working, and then getting involved with Congressman Jim Bunning. And I think another important character that I learned in that time frame, people always ask me outside of my dear friend Jim Bunning, who was my favorite politician of all time, it was Bob Dole. and the type of honesty and directness that Dole had. I tried to work in some of those features into the character of Richard Thompson. Now, on the other hand, you got Michael Griffith. Michael Griffith is a character that I developed by running campaigns, because you remember I just said I ran a bunch of people's campaigns along the way. I worked running Jim Bunning's campaign. I worked running Lawson Walker, Barry Caldwell, Clyde Middleton, all these folks. I helped them run their campaigns, and so I learned a lot through that. And the things that Griffith learned along the way is not only that, but also a large part of that character is Lee Atwater. When Jim Bunning first ran for United States Congress, the team that he put together included Lee Atwater. And Atwater was such a brilliant guy politically. Whether you were on his side or against his side, you always had to sit back and think, that guy's got it. That guy's got something that nobody else has. And so those were the type of people that I tried to build into the two characters of Griffith and Thompson. Now, when I started putting this together again, I hadn't read forever any type of political thriller. And so I thought I would base the idea on something very minute and nothing that anybody had really thought about. And it was a section of the IRS code. All of my books that I've written on the Richard Thompson series all have some element of truth in them. There's something true that has happened in and around the book that is turned later into fiction. And Section 527 was simply a section of the IRS code that allowed tax breaks for people that located in Puerto Rico. And the whole idea was that Thompson was going on and on about how we need to go to be against these type of tax breaks for corporate citizens. And yet it gets him into all this trouble then in the middle of his campaign. And the other thing that becomes a very apparent view to people who are from Northern Kentucky, it sets him up into a very much April Flowers situation. April Flowers, as those around here know, was the stripper who woke up in bed with a very surprised George Ratterman as he tried to clean up Newport many, many years ago. Richard Thompson finds himself in the same situation over this whole Section 527. Now, the funny thing about this first book was that when I wrote this book, I never thought anyone would ever want to publish it. I have to thank Kathy Teets and everybody at Headline Books for actually showing faith in me and wanting to put this book into print. But the funny thing was, when I went and I signed the contract, we sat down, we're signing the contract, and I remember Kathy looking across the table at me. I shouldn't say table, we were actually at a Holiday Inn in Huntington, West Virginia, because her daughter was Ashley was running in the track meet that weekend, the state track meet. So we're at the beautiful Holiday Inn in Huntington, West Virginia. And as I'm signing the contract, she looks at me and she goes, "What's the sequel?" And I just kind of sat there because I had never thought that anybody would want to buy my first book, let alone there would ever be a second book. Interestingly enough, I had just started working on a series of articles about steroids in baseball. And so I looked across the table at her and I said, "Well, Richard Thompson has been elected to Congress and he's dealing with his first issue on Capitol Hill, and that's steroids in baseball." And she said, "Oh my gosh, that's perfect. That's exactly what's going on right now. That'll be wonderful to sell." And I remember thinking back going, I have no idea what I just said or how I'm going to craft a book around it. But the second book became then Sniper Bid, which is the story of Congress looking into the whole issue of steroids in baseball. It was something that I had been writing editorially about and that I had been doing a lot of radio shows regarding, but I hadn't thought about there being the idea of a fictional tie-in to it. So in this particular book, there is as there always is, a crazed fan who wants to make sure things happen in a particular way, and the book opens with the whole idea of a congressman being killed by this crazed fan. The cool thing about this book was part of the research, because one of the things that happened during that time frame, again, a lot of things that I base my books on are real things that happened. Many people may remember in Cincinnati, there was a kiss cam that took place. You know, you go around and you catch the couples, and you know, you catch them and you make them kiss, and then everybody cheers. Well, they do a kiss cam at a Cincinnati Reds game, and there's a parole officer sitting at home watching this and realizing that somebody that who's supposed to be in home detention is at a baseball game giving a kiss to his girlfriend. He immediately takes a crew of officers down to the Cincinnati Reds game, and the guy is arrested in the Reds game. So my whole idea of part of this is, as the book comes to a head, is that people in the control room get to help solve the crime, help solve what's going on. And for the research, the guy who ran the control room at the time was a client of mine, a guy named Russ Jenish. And Russ let me actually come up into the scoreboard control room and watch a game from the control room. Now, I'm a huge baseball fan, and I had seen just about every aspect of baseball that you had seen. But to sit in a major league ballpark, in a new facility, Great American Ballpark, and watch them use the cameras, call camera this, call camera that, call the angles, call for the replays, and do all the things throughout an entire game, I was in hog heaven. It was one of the most fun days I spent at a ballpark. But it was part of the research. You got to do the research to make sure it's right. But part of the research that I did for this story, this book ended up being quite a surprise to me, because as the first book I did on a whim, this book I did because I couldn't come up with another idea when my publisher looked at me and said, "What's the follow-up?" Remarkably, this book ends up being one of the top 5 new books of Book News America during the year. And suddenly I sit down and I start thinking, you know, maybe there's something to this. The book stayed in the top 10 of sports fiction for quite a long time. By the way, don't go to Kindle sports fiction now, because it all involves, you know, the hockey goalie's wife. It's all you know, some of the romance books that they do. So stay out of the sports fiction if you're looking for thrillers. But it was one of those things that I suddenly started thinking, this is something I really ought to start taking it a little more seriously. You see the picture of me there sailing in captaining a boat. That was when one of the scenes is actually taking place on Kentucky Lake, and that's from the picture captions that I did at the time of my story of the book, of going through that whole thing. And Lytle Thomas was very glad that I actually didn't kill the boat, although I nearly did that day. But we did get it back to the dock. But the thing that came out of that second book was that, you know, maybe there's something to this writing. And so I started attending book sessions. I started teaching at book sessions, but also going to book writers conferences, not only to be on a panel, but I would sit back and I'd start listening. And through this, I met one of the people who became my mentor in writing, and that's a guy named Rod Pennington. He's one of the kings of writing. I call him the king of dialogue, the best dialogue writer that I've ever known. Has written a lot of scripts out of Hollywood. And he became somebody who started mentoring me into my book writing career, and led me into this third book, which became kind of an interesting book for me. The third book that I wrote in the Richard Thompson series was a book called Manifest Destiny. Now, first off, I use this picture because I wanted to point out, here I am at Book Expo America, stack of books, lines of people behind me. The books have finally taken off, but if you look back at Ashley, yeah, she really isn't all that interested in what's happening with my success. So I just wanted to point that out, Ashley. Found that picture, and it did kind of look like you're just reading the New York Daily News there. But Manifest Destiny became a very interesting book for me, on a couple of different accounts. First off, as always, it was based on some part of fact. And there were 2 pieces of fact in this book that the whole, maybe three, that the whole story is based upon. And the book opens up during the War of 1812. And in the War of 1812, if you remember your history from high school, the British made it all the way to the White House, destroying things along the way. And when they went to the Capitol, they broke into the Capitol, they set the Capitol afire, and they took the mace. If you take a look at the book cover, that's the current mace. And the mace is a fasci. It's a group of wood sticks that are wrapped together with silver ribbon, meaning that the sticks together one at a time might be able to be broken, but when joined together, they can't be broken. And it was the ceremonial symbol of the House of Representatives, that when the House was in session, the mace would be brought forward, boom, and put down in front of the members of the House of Representatives. Well, during the War of 1812, the mace was stolen. More than likely, the mace, on its way back to Britain, there were 3 ships that went back from Washington carrying the bounty that they had gotten from Washington. One of them sank just offshore in Great Britain. More than likely, the mace was on that boat. But what if it wasn't? And that's how the fiction writer ends up coming with stories. That was the whole idea behind this, was that what if the mace hadn't been stolen? What if, in fact, the mace, the original mace from pre-1812, what if it still existed? What if it was being hidden somewhere? Now, the other thing that takes place in this story is that right around the time that I started writing this book, I had the opportunity to meet some folks from the International Republican Institute for Democracy. And these were 2 women who had been the first 2 women into Romania after Ceausescu had been assassinated by his own people. If you remember when Russia fell and everything started coming down, the Russian people took over, the people of Romania took over the government. They had a speedy trial for Ceausescu and his wife, assassinated them in the public square. And these 2 women had been 2 of the first people into Romania, actually sneaking across the border without passports to go in and to try and help some of the pro-democracy parties set up free elections inside Romania. And when they were telling the stories, they were just sitting at dinner with them, and they were just absolutely fascinating. So I started to try and figure out how I'm going to link this whole idea of the War of 1812, of the mace disappearing, and these women who made their way into Romania. It ends up that I find out another fact in all of this that becomes part of the factual part of the book, was that we had a very cozy relationship with Romania during the 70s, because Romania was the one country that, even though communist, wasn't leading that hard to Russia and could be tempted away to some of the pro-economy, pro-capitalist nations. And so during that time frame, Richard Nixon actually gave Ceausescu a car, a black Buick to be exact. And that ends up being one of the clues of the book. So when you see this whole thing taking place, those are the factual things that are behind Manifest Destiny. Interestingly enough, the car still exists. I saw online about 2 years ago that it was sold at auction by somebody who finally owned it, and the car is still out there that Nixon gave to Ceausescu. The thing that I ended up having trouble with this book was that, and this is where my writing critics that read my books before they go out, and Rod Pennington helped me with so much, was that I got to a point where I got the story so involved I had no idea how to finish it. And I really had to start digging deep and digging into the characters. I remember sending the book out the first time and everybody coming back and going, yeah, this just doesn't work. So sometimes on books, when you think you're done and you think you got to the end, sometimes you're going to send it out to your sample readers and you're going to go, nah, not there yet. The thing that happened from this book and from that rewriting process was that this book did end up becoming the Independent Book of the Year, ended up winning the Paris Book Festival, ended up getting actually a movie contract out of it. Now, if you happen to notice you've never actually seen the movie Manifest Destiny or a BBC series, which is what they tried to sell it as, because like every other writer out there who has gotten a movie deal, a lot of times you get the movie deal, but the movie never gets funded. But it was kind of cool to have your book on the front page of Variety magazine and have people talking about how it was going to make a great BBC series and all these other things. But as you can see, Ashley is back in the back and she's reading Variety there and probably saying, yeah, this book is never going to be made. That brings us to the next book, which ends up being my favorite book, and my favorite book in the Richard Thompson series. This book is Writ of Mandamus. It is my favorite book because it's my favorite character that I've ever created outside of Thompson and Griffith. It was a guy who was running against Thompson, and he was kind of a combination of 2 or 3 lawyers who had gone out and absolutely kicked my butt as a young lawyer in Northern Kentucky. But they were all guys who would, if they do that, they'd take you aside and they'd pat you on the back and they'd bring you into their office and they'd tell you what they did wrong. And this book is interesting because, as I said, a lot of the books end up having some realism behind them. In this book, the idea behind the book is that during the Carter administration, the United States sold a whole bunch of F-14s to the Iranian government. Over the years, they began to salvage these things, take parts off of one, put them into another, do these various things with it, to where even today, we don't know how many of these airplanes are able to fly a short distance and possibly drop a payload on some neighboring country. No one's quite sure how many they are. And it's one of the reasons why in some of the laws that Congress has passed, it's illegal to actually take some of these parts and trade them with Iran. Remember the stories about the $800 hammer? That was the thing back in the day that the airplane companies used to do. Instead of using a 3-prong plug-in, they would make a special 18-prong plug-in. Why? Well, because you could only get the 18-prong plug-in from, say, GE. You couldn't go down to Home Depot and buy one of those. So they would make these parts that were very expensive. So the whole idea of this book is that there is somebody trying to smuggle these parts into Iran, these airplane parts for F-14s. The funny thing that happened is that this was right after Katrina. When I first started writing the book, the shipments were going to go out of the port of New Orleans because New Orleans was such a mess at the time. Middle of writing the book, someone was arrested for trying to ship F-14 parts out of New Orleans over to Iran. So sometimes you get into the middle of the book and go, gonna have to change this one. So we moved some things around and we decided instead of shipping them through the port of New Orleans, we would work our way into where one of my favorite things, horse racing, would become the way in which they did this. The other thing that had 2 other things happen during this book. One was that the book was inspired by a trip my wife and I took for our 25th wedding anniversary to Ireland. Absolutely the most phenomenal trip we've ever taken. If you've never been to Ireland, please go. You don't know the color green until you've actually been to Ireland. And so a lot of the book not only takes place in Kentucky at what is happening and in Washington, but the tie-in is in Ireland and the beauty that we saw when we went there. I will say to people, it's one of the things that I've learned in books about, if you remember last week, we talked about making sure that you get your facts right. There's a story in this book at the end of the book that involves special forces coming in to do a rescue. Actually based upon a real special forces event that a member of the team that performed it told me about. So the story that happens, I have them come in and they actually do the rescue at the end. The funny thing about this was I did the chapter that involved the special forces coming in and doing the rescue, and they're coming in on helicopters called Little Birds. And I said in the book, in the distance, you could hear the thump, thump, thump of the Little Birds. Immediately, my friend called me up and said, dude, it's why they're little birds. They don't go thump, thump, thump. They're very quiet. The first time you know they're there is when we're standing in front of you with a gun going, would you like to die? So again, jump back in, do the whole story again, do it different. There's no thump, thump, thump of little birds because that's the sound that a helicopter makes. It's the sound a big helicopter makes, not a little bird that's coming in. One of the things where you had to make sure the facts were right. But again, my favorite book, I think, because of the characters that I created for it back in Northern Kentucky, that were the candidate and the family that was running against Richard Thompson for Congress that year. You want to get one, you want to start out in the series, you want to do something. I think that again is where a lot of my writing really kicked in, where it all seemed to come together. The next book is The Advanced Man, which takes place in Washington, D.C. You'll see there I'm typing and working on that book as I'm sitting in front of Sloppy Joe's in Key West. It's funny, when I do a lot of my writing, I like to do it when I'm out amongst people or I'm out amongst bars. So places like Key West or the local pub end up being a very good place for me to write. I like to say it's me bringing out my inner Hemingway. My wife, Linda, just says I just happen to like to drink while I'm writing. This book ends up being more of a whodunit than the others. The vice president is assassinated. A young advanced man is accused, and members of the gay community in Washington, D.C. end up hiding him in plain sight as they search for who really killed the vice president. A couple things are interesting about this book is that this book took longer than any other book for me to actually get to print. And the reason being was that as I was writing it, it was 95% done. I mean, we were in the point of Linda, with my wife Linda, who is my best editor, was doing the final reads as she was walking through this stuff, and we started watching season 2 of House of Cards, and the book ended up being a mirror image of season 2 of House of Cards. And I remember calling up Kathy, my publisher, and going, I know I told you this book would be done by whatever date, but we can't do this book. Because if we come out with this book now, they're just going to say it's ripping off House of Cards. So for everybody out there that thinks you have the brilliant idea that nobody else would ever come up with, yeah, somebody else is working on that right now. I can give you a testament to that. We started over with the book from the very first chapter, redid the whole thing, rewrote the whole thing, kind of kept the basic theme alive in the book. The funny part about this book was doing the research, because one thing I wanted to do was, again, make sure I got some of this the facts right. So the part of the book takes place in the largest building in DC. DC has a interesting zoning code ordinance that no building can be higher than the United States Capitol. And that is because somebody actually once built an apartment building taller than the Capitol. Everybody in Washington was outraged. They changed the law, so that ended up being the apartment where I wanted the chase scene to start. Now I had the chase scene start there and end up into the closest LBGT bar. So here comes Rick and his pal Kunal as we walk back the back alleys from his apartment into this place and walk into a bar and start taking pictures and start giving the idea of this is where the hero would be hidden in plain sight. And people who were at the bar started asking us questions about what we were doing, and the interview between us and them about doing research for the book became just an absolute riot. I remember somebody saying, well, you ought to have him go down to the other bar, and the guy said, no, that would be too rough for him. He wouldn't like it in that bar. He would obviously want to go down to the bar down and giving me all these different places where I should go to do research. And so it was a very fun book to write. And again, a little more whodunit than the other books. And leads us right now to the current book that I have out, which is Opposition Research. I have the photo down in the right-hand corner. Of course, I've come out with a book that I'm supposed to be out right now on book tour with as we go into COVID. That is a drawing done by Berkeley Breathed, author photo stand-in, Mr. Opus. That's about what I'm doing right now, is standing in as the author, knocking out to go to any bookstores, do any signatures, do any promotion of the book. But this, again, has a real-life part to it. And the whole idea is, if you were doing opposition research, so Thompson is now out of his whole congressional mode. He's now retired, and he's working for Griffith and doing opposition research. Well, the idea of the book is, what would you do if you found something really, really bad about somebody in opposition research, but it had nothing to do with the electability of the candidate or how the person would serve? What would you do with it? And it's the moral dilemma that Thompson faces in this particular book. If anybody here is fans of the movie Goodfellas, when you read it, it's all going to come to light to you. Because at one point, Henry Hill lived about 200 yards away from my law office while he was in witness protection. The other nice, cool thing about this book was a lot of it comes from a night that a bunch of us had down in Little Italy when we were in for the Book Expo America, down hanging out in Little Italy, and the whole idea of the opening scene taking place in Little Italy. A tribute to my wife here is that nothing was coming together until she said, you know, there needs to be music playing. And we looked up what, for the time frame of what it was, what the #1 song was in America at the time, and it happened to be Frankie Valli in the Four Seasons singing "Oh What a Night." What a better song blaring out the windows of a tenement building in Little Italy than just that. So those are the Richard Thompson series that we have here, and those are the thrillers that I've written that are in the series. But I've also written a second series of books, and the second series of books people have heard me talk about. They're a little bit different, in large part inspired by my hero in writing, the person who got me interested in wanting to become a writer in the first place, and that is Jesse Stewart. Jesse Stewart was the Mountain Laureate of Kentucky. He wrote these beautiful coming-of-age novels like Hide of the Hunter and The Thread That Runs Through and Taps for Private Tussie, that talked about how people came of age in the area that he lived in, a little place called W. Holler down in eastern Kentucky. And when I was 17 years old, I got to meet the old man and was just fascinated by him. I had this idea for a novel. I could never figure out what the novel was about. When I was midway into this whole writing experience of writing the thrillers, I finally came to the idea of what my novel, with my great coming of age novel, was all about. And it ended up being about the angst of turning 50. And the difference between my great uncle, who was one of my heroes, who spent his latter years of his life living in the Everglades, and myself and my children, and what the difference between each one of us believed was the definition of success. I wanted to make sure it was different than the thriller, so I wrote this first person with third person flashbacks going into it. And it all taking place in the Everglades or back in Ludlow. Now, if you look, this is my author picture that I had for this, and because part of it goes through the little bit of the history of Skunk Ape. If you look here, right here in the right-hand corner of the picture, thanks to Kevin Kelly designing the book cover and designing the author picture for me, we can see that Skunk Ape actually does exist. There's an authentic picture. I swear to God, somebody actually sent me a picture one time and said, somebody emailed one time and said, "Is that Skunk Ape looking around the tree?" And I didn't notice that. Is there an animal there? But truthfully, thanks to Kevin Kelly for putting Skunk Ape into the picture and into the story. So, it's this the fun part of this book was that as I was there, it was spending a couple days with my brother-in-law, Wade DeHate, and his friend, Jimmy Chastain, as we went through the Everglades, learned about some of the history of the Seminole tribes where my uncle had lived on the Seminole Reservation, great uncle lived on the Seminole Reservation, and going back on some of these back roads that revealed Florida from 200 years ago. and it was absolutely fantastic to take a look at that area from the point of view. I mean, the Everglades is one big river, right? It's the widest, shallowest river in the world. And by the time you get to the point where we're at here, you look at the water behind you, and you can actually not only see all the fish, but you can tell which breed they are as they go swimming past. It was a fantastic experience. Probably the most fun I ever had doing the research of a book was doing this one. And if the angst of turning 50 was one book, then the angst of turning 60 became The Promise of Cedar Key. And The Promise of Cedar Key was something, Bobby and Jan McCabe, my friends, were living down there at the time, and said, you got to come down, you got to see this place. And it reminded me so much of growing up in Bromley, Kentucky. And there you see the house that I grew up in when I was a kid. And so much of this little island reminded me of being in that same setting. If you would take water and instead of just putting it on the river around in Bromley, but put it around it and make it into an island, there was so much there that reminded me of what was going on. And Bobby had been a tour guide down there and knew all the stories of the city and knew all the stories of what happened and what was happening in Cedar Key. And so I took those ideas of turning 60 and put them into The Promise of Cedar Key. Now, those are the two series that I've written. I've also gotten tied into a couple of books with Kathy along the way. And I'm going to tell you first off, this is true with every author. I will almost 90% of every author that is out there would rather be a rock and roll star. They'd rather be into music. I am no exception. You know, here I am doing my best Marty Stewart impersonation. I would, writers, we really think we're all rock stars. Although I used to do a seminar when I would go around to book shows, and one of the title of the seminar was Authors Got No Groupies. And that is true. But Kathy called me up one day and she said, I have just landed the opportunity to write the story of Landau Eugene Murphy Jr. And I said, congratulations, who's that? She said, well, he just won America's Got Talent season 6. Now, I was not a fan of reality TV, but I suddenly soon come to find out that Landau Murphy was actually more popular than any governor or anybody else in the state of West Virginia. I said, Kathy, it's really not my gig. I don't know that I could write somebody else's biography. I don't know that I could write in somebody else's voice. She said, well, just come and meet him. I think you'll like his personality. He's, I think he's kind of funny like you. Well, he was. This is the picture we took as I was interviewing him for his life story. And this is the picture that I tried to pitch Kathy to use as the author photo, where we were singing Up in the Air Junior Birdmen together and taking this picture. She thought that it should be a little more serious, like the cover on the front of the book. Turns out Landau ends up being just a wonderful human being. I get out of the car. The first time I go to meet him, we're in West Virginia. I get out of the car and I'm wearing a pair of red Chuck Taylor gym shoes. We happen to pull up right at the same time. And as I get out of the car, first thing he looks at me and goes, red Chuck Taylors. And I look at his and he was wearing it. He had just won $1 million for being, winning America's Got Talent. And I said, yeah, you want to trade? He was wearing these expensive Air Jordans. He goes, no, I think I'll stick with mine. And we ended up having just so much fun writing this book. And the cool thing is that over the years, as Landau has made it into different places, I've been in New York City, I've been in Charleston, I've been places where he's been performing. I'll show up, always points me out from the stage, always does something. I always tell him that I'm going to ruin the night by trying to come up on stage and sing Mustang Sally with me. He, in fact, says he will only do that is if you notice his dreads, he also has a dreadlock wig. He said, I'm only allowed to come on stage if he wears the if I wear the dreadlock wig. So at some point, you may see me in a picture similar to what we have here, where we're being Junior Birdman, where I'm up on stage singing Mustang Sally with a set of dreads. Interesting. The tough part about this book was writing in somebody else's voice, because here is a guy who had grown up as the son of a coal miner in West Virginia, moved to the mean streets of Detroit, came back to West Virginia, has an amazing story of how he made it to America's Got Talent. And overnight, he told me the story of checking, after he won America's Got Talent, checking into a hotel in New York, and the lady asked him for a credit card. And he said, lady, yesterday I didn't even have credit. Today you want a card for me? But being able to talk in his voice, help him tell his story in a voice that was his and not mine. And we had a wonderful time letting him tell the stories into a tape recorder, and then I would come back and try and interpret them and put them in a way that I thought he would say them. And again, Landau, we were together at the American Library Association last year, and they finally had to break the two of us up. They had to say we had to stand on the other side because we were having far too much fun, and I think driving customers away instead of getting them to the booth is what we were supposed to do. I have done one other co-writing event, and Dennis Hetzel has been on Zoom in 2 books a couple of times, talking about things. This is a book where the only time you will ever see me in a Chicago Cubs hat. Cincinnati Reds fan, beloved Cincinnati Reds all the way. If I were wearing anything, I'd be wearing number 28 Vada Pinson jersey. But we were driving to a chamber event out of Northern Kentucky to Frankfort, and started making up ideas and fun stories about what a good book would make. And we came up with the idea of, what if the Cubs were in the World Series? Now, at the time, that was really fiction, because the curse has still been put on the Cubs by Billy Goat, and by Billy Goat Giannis had put the curse on the Cubs that them Cubs are never going to win again. And we had all the stories, we knew all the background, and what if the Cubs were in the position where they could win the series, but there was a crazed fan that wanted to make sure they really, really did. We were so into the story. Dennis did not tell this on his Zoom into books the other day, but we were so into it on the way back that he got a speeding ticket on the way back from Frankfurt as we continued to create this story. We wrote about half the story together, and then Dennis took it from there, and it's been a fun book to talk about. That, I mean, let's face it, we predicted that the Cubs were going to win the series before the Cubs won the series. Now, the final book to talk about, before we get into a few questions here, is the one that I've had number 1. At the time when I started writing for Kathy, I was doing a lot of political humor columns. I was writing for Rare, which is Cox Media, their big website. I was writing for the Daily Caller. I was writing for a couple people here locally. And it was a time when people were actually allowed to laugh at politics. You know, now everybody's kind of nasty and angry about it. I don't write about politics as much as I used to, because nobody really finds humor in it anymore. But I've been writing for a couple years, and suddenly we started looking at the number of pages and the number of lines and words that we had in it, and I called Kathy and I said, you know, I think there's actually enough for a book here. And so we came up with the line Strange Bedfellow. Kevin Kelly once again went out of his way into making me into looking like truly the person from the line that politics makes strange bedfellows. Remarkably, we put this thing on Kindle and put it out there, and it shoots to number 1 in the Kindle humor ranking. And I was so happy, because it actually went ahead of 2 people that I know and 2 people who are writing heroes of mine, and that was P.J. O'Rourke and Dave Barry. And that are my book for about a week, sat atop of them in the Kindle humor section. if you pick it up today, there's a lot of old references in it. There's a lot of things get to go back to several administrations backwards. I don't write as much political humor as I used to because people have forgotten how to laugh. But this was the one book that I had that went #1. What was cool during this time was that not only did I have this #1 in humor, but the first 3 political Thompson books were all in the top 100 of political thrillers at the same time. So that was at a time when everything was really happening, really kind of fun. But this is one of the ones that I was really kind of proud of at the time, more than anything else, because I was beating out Dave Barry and P.J. O'Rourke at the time. So I'll leave with that. You got any questions? I know Mike Ditcham was wanting to know when I was going to be coming back down to West Virginia again. And Kathy, I'll let you at some point jump in here. And is West Virginia going to have the book festival again this year? And now that they've redone the new convention center? Ashley, there you go. Are we going? Yes. Are we going back to West Virginia this October?
So far, so good. We haven't heard any negative news, so we're going to take that as positive news.
One of the fun things about writing books is that you get to go to a lot of different writing conferences and writing conventions and book fairs. West Virginia has always been one of my favorites. They used to have one in Huntington that we were just laughing about before we went on the air here. I remember when the first book came out, it was going to start sleeting, and so I left early. But Kathy and Ashley told me not to worry because the snow and the sleet always go around Huntington.
They usually do.
Never hits Huntington.
That was not our fault.
They end up shutting down Interstate 64, and I remember all the authors, the only thing we had to do for 3 days was to sit and talk to each other inside the conference center, and then in the evening go over and see the comedians at the comedy club because they were stuck there as well, and nobody was leaving their homes in Huntington. And it was us and the comedians and a couple authors going over every night to the mall, and either we would go and listen to somebody's act, and then we go see a movie. Got stuck in Huntington for 3 days because the snow always goes around Huntington, right, Ashley?
That is just a captive audience. So I hope that you sold each of those people a book. If you didn't, that was a major fail on your part.
Did sell a bunch of books there, and also got to meet Lisa Scottaline, who was just a wonderful, wonderful person, and a very funny writer as well. When we were at that one. Ashley, do we have any other questions?
Yes, we do. First, we have a comment from Mike, who says, by the way, my Blue Jays are tied for first place in MLB.
Yeah, your Blue Jays are tied in first place along with my beloved Cincinnati Redlegs. So please, don't Mike, come on. Don't go there. Don't go there yet, man. Hey, I will Mike, I will tell you to take a look at the River City News over the next couple of days. I did a fun story about the Moonlight Graham of the Cincinnati Reds. In the movie Field of Dreams, there's a true character in there called Archie Moonlight Graham. Moonlight Graham was a player in the minor leagues, came up to the bigs, had one appearance, but never made it as an at-bat. That's one of the people that Ray Cancel is looking for in the movie. Turns out I end up finding through a podcast that I do on Wednesdays on Major League Baseball called Chin Music. I end up meeting a guy named Rick Green, who had one appearance, 5 2/3 innings for the Cincinnati Reds. So Mike, take a look at it. Take a look at River City News. I know which Mike we're talking about here. He's the only one who would dare cheer for Canadian team during Major League Baseball season. So Mike, I'll make sure you get a copy of that when it comes out. But yeah, I've met the Moonlight Graham of the Cincinnati Reds. Hey, by the way, as you're looking at the screen here, I know take a look at Headline Books and the phone number there. If you want paper, right now, Amazon is running behind on their deliveries. They're making sure that the deliveries that go out are the deliveries that are essential to people's health and well-being and things of that nature. I've had a dozen flies for fly fishing on order now for 6 weeks. They still keep moving it back every week because it's not a priority delivery. Obviously, they've never been fishing before to say that, you know, these flies are not an essential delivery. But if you're going to order paperback right now, the place to go is to go directly to headlinebooks.com or dial the phone there, and that will be the place you can pick up any of the books we've talked about today. I'm sorry, Ashley, do we have another one?
Yes, we do. Have you found COVID-19 to provide you with extra writing time?
I have been able to write during the COVID period. I've been able to write shorter columns, the 750, 1,500 columns. The thing that I find very, very hard for me is I find it very hard to write at home. I have to go out where there's bustling activity. I think it's my personality. There's things, if things are going on around me, I can concentrate on what's on that screen right there. If I'm sitting here at home right now at my desk, my mind goes in every different direction, and, you know, oh, look, there's a squirrel. So, you know, I mean, it's very hard for me to do that. So I have a book that is in progress called The Soul Remains Intact. It's part of the coming of age series, as I refer to it as coming of age for old guys with gray hair that never came of age. It's part of that series, and I've been having trouble getting, I get bits and pieces of inspiration. I write them down on pieces of paper, but I'm having trouble coming up with continuing the story. I really need for one of these bars to open back up so I can go in and there be some activity at least 6 feet away from me where I can continue to write.
Always social distance.
That's right.
We do have a comment from John. He says, Rick gave me a lot of support when I was able to take a short story I wrote and turn it into a documentary.
John Lucas wrote one of the things I tell people. Everybody that comes to me, John, I referenced to your book just this week. Everybody that comes to me and says, I have this idea, now what should I do with it? I always say to them, what do you want to get out of the process? What do you want to get out of the idea of publishing a book? And when John Lucas came to me with that he had the story of Stan Bowman, who was the greatest race car driver that never was. And I say that because he was a rookie driver in the Indy series when Indy was a very dangerous place to be. The open wheel racers, anybody who's a gearhead out there who's listened to this will know that it's a very dangerous time. John came to me with this idea about a guy named Stan Bowman, who as a rookie got a ride in the Indy 500. And then 2 weeks before the Indy 500 started, but was going to take place, died in a very tragic wreck at an Indy race. His ride for that Indy race went to some kid named Mario Andretti. So Mario Andretti got his start because Stan Bowman from Covington, Kentucky, was killed in this car wreck. And when I asked John that question, he just wanted to tell the story. He just wanted to tell what was going on with it, and about this guy from his neighborhood who was the strapping, you know, athlete that everybody looked up to in the neighborhood. Now, the funny part about that is that I can remember John getting excited when they would sell a book. You know, he'd call me and go, hey, I looked on Kindle today. We sold a couple books. Of course, out of all the people that I've talked to, helped with, worked with, know they're in the writing business, John is the guy that actually who didn't want to do anything with the book other than tell the story. He got the movie deal. So if you get a chance, wonderful documentary called The Bravest of Them All, The Legend of Stan Bowman, is a wonderful, wonderful documentary starring people like John Lucas, who tells the story of what happened, but also starring people like Mario Andretti gave his full time to this effort in making this movie, and it's a wonderful, wonderful movie. And anybody who gets a chance to see John Lucas or any of the showings he has of this, please take the time to go see it, because it's a great story.
Great. That is all that we have right now. But if somebody thinks of a question that they'd like to ask you later, what's the best way to get in touch with you, Rick?
They can send it to Richard Lee Robinson at yahoo.com, or they can send it right there go to Headline Books, because that's the place you want to buy the books anyway, because I know everybody's going to want to buy books. Go to Headline Books, and they can actually forward the email from there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much. Again, we've been doing another Zoom Into Books presentation featuring Independent Author of the Year, Rick Robinson. And if you did miss any of the presentation tonight, we will have the video up on our Facebook page as well as the Zoom Into Books YouTube channel. So be sure to check that out along with the rest of our authors' presentations. Thanks again, Rick. Awesome job.
Thanks, Ashley.